This won't last very long, but we'll go. Okay, so, okay, let's talk about the 6 principles of IDEA. Okay, they are on. 6 principles of IDEA on page 3. The first one is what's called zero reject. That means, according to this federal law, that no student will be denied a free public education and the disability or the services that they need. When we're talking about special education services, what are we talking about? There's 2 categories.
The gifted and the disabilities.
No, that's 2 categories or classifications of special ed. I'm talking about services. Have you ever heard of the word accommodations? Accommodations and strategies. These are not categories, these are classifications of services, special education services. You'll get this over and over again, don't worry about it right now. But zero reject says that no kid, no student will be denied services. They will not be denied the accommodations that they need based on their disability or the strategies. Okay? Yes, ma'am? No? Okay. Number 2, non-discriminatory evaluation process, which we're going to talk about next, must be in their native language. Okay? Again, this is in your notes. 3, they must have an appropriate education, requires schools to tailor education to the specific needs of all students. So, an IEP, a plan. Do you guys know what an IEP is? IEP is an individualized education plan. And all students who are identified with a disability through the non-discriminatory evaluation process will ultimately end up with a plan, an IEP. What is in this plan?
What they'll do, right?
Well, what their disability is, but what else? It's a plan to help them what?
Individual education there.
Yeah, and it lists the accommodation, the strategies, and a bunch of other things that would help that student learn. That's what's in the plan. Okay, that's an IEP. It also must, the student must also be placed in what is called the least restrictive environment. This is a concept you need to underline and star, because this is, you will have to know this, but it is a bit confusing for people, so we're going to talk about it at length. When I say least restrictive environment, what do you think I'm talking about? What comes to mind? Because I'm talking about the educational setting. If there was a student who was severely mentally retarded, what would be the least restrictive environment that would be acceptable for educating that person?
Maybe one-on-one with another para.
Okay. What would the range look like? A one-on-one tutor process. And then on the other end of that continuum might be what? For a severely mentally retarded person, we don't see it so much anymore, but we used to put them in specific hospitals or wards, right? And they would have very restrictive, locked environments. That's what's called restrictive, okay? A least restrictive environment for that student who is severely mentally retarded would be maybe living at home and getting home tutoring. Where would be a middle ground between home and isolated hospital? A public school classroom would be somewhere in the middle, right? What else would be in the middle? Where would a special school be for a person who is severely mentally retarded? Would it be towards the end of the hospital spectrum? Yeah, it would. So what I'm saying here is that there is a degrees with every disability. There's a span that we need to look at as it pertains to what we call least restrictive, okay? For most students in our public schools, what do you think the least restrictive environment is going to be?
Classroom.
The classroom, absolutely. The regular, or as they called in the book, the general education classroom, is always considered the least restrictive environment in the public school. You need to write that down on some place in your notes.
Can you say it again?
The least restrictive environment in a public school setting is always going to be the regular general classroom. Because in that classroom, they're there with all the other kids. They're included. So, if I was to put on the board home, and then all the way down the other end of this continuum, we have hospital. We said that a private school for the mentally retarded would fall maybe here. Private school. Where would and then maybe public school would be here. Because again, one extreme to the other. Where would, let me see here. Where would the special education classroom be? The resource room?
In between them.
In between what?
In public school and private school.
That's right, it would be over here. Because it's alone, it's separate, right? It's more restrictive because it's not inclusive with the regular kids, with the other kids and what they're doing. So you need to kind of get this idea in your head, because with every disability we're going to talk about the degree of severity and where that falls as it pertains to a bunch of things. All right? Very good. Okay. Not only do they need to be in the least restrictive environment by federal law, that's why we don't see kids in the resource room so much anymore, but they also have to have what's called due process. What do I mean when I say you students here at Chadron State have due process? Do you know that you do? Do you know that by federal law in the United States as a citizen of this country that you have due process as it pertains to being convicted of a crime, whether it's a parking ticket or some other more severe crime? You have a due process procedure. What is that as it pertains to crime?
It means that the government follows the same policy no matter who's doing the crime or
It's
allegedly
fair and
doing the
equal
crime.
for everybody, right? You have the right to an attorney. You have to, there's certain steps and procedures that must be followed. You have the right to a trial, all of those things. The same thing is true for you as a student at Chadron State or any other public institution. You have the right, you have due process at college here. What if you take one of my exams and I catch you cheating and you say, Dr. King, I wasn't cheating. And I'm like, yeah, Jim, you were. You were cheating off Dave. Big time, I saw it. And you're like, no, I wasn't. And I give you a fail, and I fail you from the course. Does Jim have due process rights here at Chadron State?
Yeah.
Yeah, what are they? They're in your student handbook if you don't know. But
You
what
can
are they?
appeal that.
What?
You can appeal.
You can appeal, and who do you appeal to? There's a process that you go through, right?
Right.
You go to your advisor, then you go to the department chair, which happens to be me, so. But then you would refer on, you would appeal it to the dean of students, right? And the dean of students would make an evaluation of whether you agreed or didn't agree with him. You could then take it on to the student appeals. The student council has an appeals, student senate, I guess, has an appeals committee, and you would appeal it to them, all right? So there is a procedure in place. Do you get it? Okay? In the case of students who are disabled or who are being identified as being disabled, there is a due process procedure called the non-discriminatory evaluation process. Every student identified with a disability legally has to go through that step-by-step procedure. That's their due process, okay? That step-by-step procedure, there are 4 steps to it. We're going to talk about that next. The last of the 6 principles of IDEA is that there must be parental and student participation. Parents must be informed, they must be educated about the procedure, and they must be involved in the process. Okay? Now, what about the student? If we notice that 45% of all of our kids are identified as being disabled in elementary school, let's say Maggie is in 3rd grade. How old is she in 3rd grade? 9?
8.
8?
9.
Is she old enough to be participating in this process?
She has a right to be there.
Well, she has a right to be represented.
But at least her parents have to be they have to agree with what the
Correct.
says.
Parents have to agree to.
Or they can appear.
Well, the parents have to agree, one, that she participate in the process. If they say no, we don't want her tested, then you're SOL as a teacher. You just do the best you can. Okay? Parents have to agree. But I'm asking, does Maggie, as a 8-year-old, do you think it's in her best interest to sit around a table with a bunch of adults who are identifying what's wrong with her and what she needs to do in order to improve? What might that do to her?
Self-esteem.
Yeah. In some cases, we need to look at self-esteem issues, confusion, intellectual ability, and that makes a decision about whether Maggie, as a youngster, should participate. Now, as Maggie gets older, right, in school, she becomes 9th grader, 10th grader. Should she participate in the process then? I would think so, because she's old enough to understand, she can communicate clearly, she understands what's being talked about around the table, and she understands at that point that people are just trying to help and assist her. And she can provide input as well, can't she? About what works for her in the way of strategies and accommodations that have helped and worked for her successfully in the past. Make sense? Okay, so depends. Those are the 6 principles of IDEA. Now let's turn to the back page. Let's talk about the non-discriminatory evaluation process. There are 4 steps. This is like the due process. Bless you, Tommy. These are like the due process steps. Every kid needs to go through this if they have been identified with a disability. The first step is what we call screening. I'm going to come back and talk with you about screening in a moment. The second step is pre-referral or RTI. The second or third step is the referral process, and the 4th step is actually what we call testing or non-discriminatory evaluation. That's where the process of non-discriminatory evaluation gets its name, because ultimately it ends up in identification, a process, a test, if you will, that determines whether or not the student has a disability or not. What if we go through this non-discriminatory process, the 4 steps, and we find out that, Maggie, who we thought was dyslexic, actually isn't, bless you. She's not dyslexic. She does not have a disability. What happens then? Because the tests did not confirm that she was disabled in reading with dyslexia. What do we do now as a teacher? We're like, oh well, guess what we're wrong.
No, can't you assign paras or specific tutors? No.
Maybe. Mary Lou? You have to do the best you can, but what might the next thing be? Maybe it's not reading. Maybe we were testing for the wrong thing. So with the parent's permission, we might not necessarily go back, or with their permission, we might go back and test for maybe a communication disorder or a vision impairment. I mean, there's other things that we need to rule out before we give up, right? And for each one of those disabilities that we test, we go through this process. Screening, pre-referral, referral, testing. 4 steps of the non-discriminatory evaluation process. You will need to know the 4 steps, you will need to be able to define them, and you will need to know